Okay, you can start. I will deal with this. Okay.
Okay. All right. So I'll just share my screen. Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you, everyone. So I'll just quickly get on with the opening remarks. Before I get into the detail, I'll just briefly talk about how this, I'll just add to what Esther said. This is a sort of an experiment, because this is the whole idea was a lot of us are working in many different disciplines that cuts across climate change in many different ways. So, I'm not an expert in any of these, but, I'm just trying to wrap my brain around the sort of like the gaps and the problems that we see, at least that I've seen through my field work and my entanglements and my ongoing work. So I was just talking to Martin about it. I mean, there's, and then I picked up this title, so it's a plagiarism from, if you know Ananya Roy's work. This is from Ananya Roy's work, Who's Afraid of Post-Coloniality. So it's a revival of that feeling that Ananya Roy really got a lot of sort of like resistance when she initially started talking about things, which now we take for granted somewhat. So, if you follow the discourse around 20 years ago. So in the same sense, I want to sort of like replace the fear for the pluriverse with something I think which is much more problematic, which is what I talk about, the climate chasm, and I'll talk about that. But maybe the starting point for me is to talk about this notion of, when we talk about pluriverse, what is different, and what sort of difference are we thinking about? So this is just to bring something back from Deleuze, that when he talked about difference, he said difference is not diversity. Diversity is given, but difference is that by which the given is given, which is a long-winded way of saying that there can be different kinds of difference. So when people say we want a multicultural England, there is this idea of multiculturalism, but that is very much set within a sort of like a liberal conception of what it means to have distinctive culture. So when we talk about the pluriverse, I think we're trying to move beyond that. So there is something like more ontological, the difference, not at the level of the phenomenon. So that's there in the background. Which is the idea that there are differences in kind and difference in degree. But taking this to a very particular context. So I study informal settlements, and then I work in these places, and oftentimes this is what I saw, that differences were obliterated, because you have very convenient, rich, poor, slum dweller, and that comes with a little bit of pity. So I know when I was spending a long time there, I started to realize that there are differences within. And then when I compared this through this mapping project across other settlements, yes, it's still that difference exists, but that it's quite substantially different than the slum that I showed in Dhaka. So how do we talk about these differences? Because they owe to their previous histories. So the way that it has been colonized. So the differences emerge because of very radical vantage points. So that's sort of like the background out of which I'm speaking, right? I mean, and then and this the most obvious one, this idea of the North and the South. I mean, this is Detroit, and actually that's a line that separates purely white and black. That's what you might think, but no, it's actually much more mixed than that. So there are like very poor white people living in the black neighborhood, and then very rich black people. So of course, the North and South, which feels very convenient now, might not be the best way of cutting across, these worlds that we speak of. We may question the very conception of a world that has the North and the South, or going back to the developmental discourse of the 50s, Harry S. Truman and this idea of the first world and second world, third world, all of that is actually coming from one particular worldview. So, this idea of, questioning that. So this world of multiplicity, of differentiation, this idea of many worlds. Now, of course, this has been, helpful because, you see in the recent years, books such as this one coming out, talking about all these different words and ontologies. So this dictionary sort of has it's like a plethora of these. But particularly for opening into this collective or this moment, we wanted to see how we talk about climate change. Does this help reframe some of these things that we usually talk about? So how do we usually talk about? And I'm going to talk about from the vantage point of Bangladesh because that's my context. So and I work there. So if you search, things like this will come up a lot. So this is like the typical picture of submergence. This is going to get inundated. You'll have 20 million people without a home, huge levels of migration. The city will be flooded with slums, and that's sort of like the holding line talking about climate change. And then of course the submergence, how a lot of the development projects sort of like use this to do what essentially is maladaptation. And we'll actually hear from Camelia, who is researching this impact of maladaptation in Bangladesh. We'll hear from her in about 10 minutes. So she might just talk about that. But one thing that I started looking at is what about those who remain? Because if 80% people move back or move to cities, what about 20% who remain? So I'm going to take you back, take you there to a very remote, river island, not the shop, but an island in the river, which usually gets flooded. So this is an alluvial land, and this shape shifts every 10 to 15 years. These islands get completely inundated. So every 10 to 15 years, people move their houses. So in a lifetime, people move their houses 5 times, and that's totally that's their thing. That's the way that they want to live. But even last year, there were 3 of these events. So 3 times they had to move because that scale of flooding didn't usually happen. So as you can start zooming in, this feels completely no man's land. But if you keep looking at that circle, there you have a very tiny settlement. Like this, there are 5 million people living in these settlements all across this river belt. So you come to think of it, it's a very distributed set of settlements, and you can conceive, and it's quite urban in the way that it's presenting itself. So it's that sort of landscape. And one thing that keeps coming, which is at loggerheads with the normative climate discourse, is this idea that people here oftentimes will talk about, and if you go and tell them that, oh, this happened, and then they will talk about their afterlife. So they're predominant Muslims, and they will say, yeah, this life is temporary. We'll get good things in the next life, or it doesn't matter. God gave this, which has been often derided as a very fatalistic attitude. That NGOs often have to do this, re-education camps. That so there is this complete loggerhead with the way that their ontology is sort of like spreads across worlds and different temporalities, but the discourse in climate adaptation is like, what? There's silly, stupid people who believe in very irrational things. So we need to retrain them so that they buy our microinsurance products. So there's been right now microinsurance products coming to this very riverine islands as part of this climate adaptation, that they should buy into climate. They're very fancy names. So you start to see that they talk about how their ideas, the very simple ideas that they have, that don't build schools with concrete here, it's going to get washed away. Just give us boats, and then the climate adaptation people is like, we don't do boats. We only do proper concrete buildings. So we don't care if it gets washed away. So these are the sort of like the stories that start coming. As I said, and this idea of the life, the way that they talk about environment is not, they don't see any dissociation between home, environment. When you ask them to show where is environment, they're like, I don't know what you're talking about. It's flowing through me. So It's a very different way when an environmental protection scheme starts that delineates environment in one way. So long story short, I mean, this was from my field trip last year. And even, for example, the way that the land tenure is managed in the river is absolutely not recognized by the colonial system of land, registry. So absolutely their way of dealing with land, forget that whether, this is really resilient, it's not even recognized as an epistemic, having an epistemology in itself. So we talked about this. So this paper last year came out, and we talked about this idea of what we termed as discursive partition. So we said that things have been partitioned in certain ways in that discursive world. And now the funniest thing is that's not how we present ourselves. So Bangladesh is seen as a climate adaptation, role model that produces great policies. But then on the ground, we see an evisceration of this minority ontologies that never really make up as what Bangladesh is, because this is exactly going along the script of, let's say, the large agencies, and then you follow the script, you get great policies, because if you have those policies good, you get good loans. So there's this ongoing mega projectification of climate adaptation. It's like large scale projects. You show that you have the policies, you get the funding, and then you can have your way with it. So this is the background out of which I'm coming, and then Pluriverse again helps me to negotiate with these different worlds that I keep meeting, and how to talk about them in the way of the climate. So so maybe we need some sort of generative differences to come through, and I'll stop there. But this is sort of like my opening. This is what I have in my head, and we're here to brainstorm, hopefully, and hopefully this is useful. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. So we have had 2 presentations which are pre-recorded. I think maybe we go through them first, and then we keep the online live ones later. So I'll just share, because I'm sharing my screen. So I'll just stop that. Camelia, are you here?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Hi.
Hi.
Yes. Hi.
Hi. Will you play the video since my connection is so bad?
Yes, I'm sharing the video now. Just a second.
Thank you.
So we're gonna really continue. It's gonna feel like it's a.
Hi, thank you so much, Tanzi, for this opportunity to participate in this roundtable, and also for bringing us all together to discuss how to operate pluriverse.
Yeah.
So
Just a second. Sorry, I need to share the screen. I'll share my screen completely. Okay. All right.
our last reading group, we discussed the book Pluriverse, Post-Development Dictionary. As an environmental anthropologist working on the anthropology of development, the discussion of pluriverse here really resonated with me. It discussed the importance of rethinking the development concept and its relation to multiple crises of modernity, and how development logics have worked to universalize the earth, and the internal incoherences in rhetoric, and how these are likely to become ecologically wasteful profit-making distractions. And this is exactly where I see how my work fits into these discussions about climate pluriverse. So in my book, Misreading the Bengal Delta, Climate Change Development Imaginaries in Coastal Bangladesh, I unpack narratives on modernity and the notion of a backwards global south, in this case, exemplified through Bangladesh, pointing out the historical processes behind how Bangladesh came to be impoverished through European extractivism is a key political aim of my book. Moving from being portrayed as an extremely poor country or a victim of poverty, Bangladesh is increasingly portrayed as a victim of flooding caused by rising sea levels. and it's now one of the top recipients of development aid earmarked for climate change adaptation. So the book contrasts the narratives of climate-funded projects with local environmental history and the lived experiences of social and environmental problems. And here I differentiate between physical processes of climatic changes and the discursive ideas of climate as the main cause of change through climate change. So the book demonstrates how climate change can be a powerful discursive phenomenon that alters expectations of causality. By doing so, it contests the universalizing discourse of how climate change is expected to impose itself on poor countries while guising capitalist interventions as climate adaptation. Contesting these discourses forms part of creating a climate pluriverse to include bottom-up perspectives that do not conform to these universalizing narratives of unilinear modernity. In the autumn of 2011, I was finishing 12 months of qualitative research on an internationally funded water governance project in Bangladesh's coastal zone. My field trips drew my attention to several urgent problems that our rural interlocutors had raised, from saline tiger prawn cultivation that weakened flood protection embankments and destroyed the soil, to canals which filled up with heavy sediment each year. As you can see on this image, this used to be a big river where steamers would go, and now it's barely a canal. And I did my fields work in the southwest coastal region of Bangladesh for a much larger project already in 2010 and 11. So I wanted to explore these issues further in a new project, and I began asking fellow researchers I met during the year how to best pursue this. And when I mentioned my interest in land use and the siltation of water bodies to a colleague, he mentioned the increasing amount of financial support for climate change research and proposed that the title of my research proposal ought to mention climate change. Although I followed this advice, I wondered whether this inclusion of climate change deflected attention away from the most pressing concerns that arose during my previous study. Climate change has become a buzzword used to attract donor funding, but to what extent do climate-funded projects actually address coastal vulnerabilities and needs? So in my research, I studied climate change by investigating climate change knowledge production in development aid projects. How does the idea of climate change shape the direction of development interventions in the global south? And to what extent do these interventions correspond with the concerns of the people that they're seeking to help? Reflecting on our discussions on the importance of operationalizing the pluriverse, what can be done to contest the universalizing ways in which climate adaptation is co-opted by business as usual, continuing the one world of the West and the idea of sustainable and thereby continued economic growth with its techno fixes to get there. And I returned to Bangladesh in 2014 to explore these questions of knowledge production further. On World Rivers Day, I attended a workshop organized by a grassroots environmental movement in Khulna City. The event was at the basement of a concrete building, the parking lot. Instead of cars, the space was filled with rows of plastic chairs facing a table with a large poster with the words "Save Our Rivers" in Bangla hanging above it. There was no fan, no air conditioning. It was a development meeting conducted entirely in Bangla with no presence of English-speaking international experts or donors. One of the participants, Mr. Shahid, said, "Climate change shock to Darul Moshala. Add climate change, poverty alleviation, and gender, and you will have a recipe for success for a development project. But will this recipe help save the river?" Mr. Shahid's use of climate change as a spice illustrates how local Bangladeshi development professionals act as development brokers and translators that actively build social, political, and economic roles and partake in development assemblages constituting a multiple heterogeneous development actors such as donors, NGOs, state units, and consultants, and who come together to create a common development project. So it's in the particular characteristics of each development assemblage that a broker may translate climate change as a spice. Mike Hume's concept of climate reductionism refers to the increasing tendency to attribute all changes in environment and society to climate. The policy theory of Bangladeshi climate change projects tend to be climate reductive. The policy, the country will drown due to rising sea levels caused by global warming. With the concept of climate reductive translations, I'm trying to show how different development actors, Bangladeshi, international, different types of NGOs, donors, government authorities, etc., how they come together to use climate change as a spice to link a particular development intervention or project to the policy theory of climate change. So by climate reductive translations, I'm trying to show the radically different ways adaptation interventions in Bangladesh can take shape, and the eventual problematic misreadings of South Asian waterscapes or environments that they may also give rise to. So this book is based on multidisciplinary methods where I have combined historical archival research with ethnography, both of aid-funded climate adaptation projects and in rural villages. It draws heavily on critical development studies, both by historians and anthropologists. In most Western societies, there are ideas that modern or European or capitalist societies are better than the Third World and the Global South. Historian Frederick Cooper suggests that modernity is a way of talking about the world. He argues that one of the representations of modernity portrays it as a long and continuous project where Western Europe is the model to which the rest of the world should aspire. The colonizer society is presented as advanced and embodying progress, while colonized societies are portrayed as traditional and backwards. So in this book, I look at how external ideas, external institutions, and external resources shape the current form of Bangladesh and its state. From the creation of colonial railways and World Bank embankments, to its dependence on development funding allocated to poverty reduction, modern agriculture, and now climate change. With the notion of decolonizing development, I'm trying to contest the ways in which development has been used as ways to legitimize external actors radically altering environments, societies, and former societies of the Global South. And this is part of a wider agenda decolonizing the curriculum and higher education. And this draws from my experience of the decolonizing SOAS movement in 2018, where they write that higher education is based on the assumption that global histories of Western colonial domination have had the effect of limiting what counts as authoritative knowledge, whose knowledge is recognized, what universities teach, and how they teach it. The university, as a privileged space of knowledge production and dissemination, is a key site where the historical legacy of colonial social constructions, imaginaries, practices, hierarchies, and violence still resonate today. And for me, I came across this while I was a PhD student, and it really resonated because I am a second generation Bangladeshi, born and raised in Sweden. So I've grown up in a society where media portrayals of Bangladesh were often victimizing, pauperizing, and condescending. And what I try to argue here is that the image of Bangladesh as a climate change victim reproduces historical imaginaries of its inferiority, while ignoring its complex past going back to the Buddhist Pala Empire. So the book is a decolonial project in that it situates development historically in Bangladesh and critiques the continued image of the country as poor and vulnerable. And by doing so, by decolonizing development discourses, we may better understand the links between colonial knowledge production and the knowledge production of climate change. So I do not have time to explain the full environmental history of embankments and floods now, but what I do want to say is that the current climate reductive translation of flood protection embankments as adaptation infrastructure disregards a very long history of their unsuitability in a sediment-rich monsoon delta. Similar to railway embankments in colonial Bengal, the 4,000 kilometers of coastal embankments constructed in the 1960s during the Cold War, you see the map here to the left, stopped beneficial Borsha inundations. That means beneficial monsoon inundation, and the silt deposits outside the embankments raising land levels. So during heavy rains, the water cannot drain to the river but gets waterlogged. Indeed, natural scientists suggest that riverbed sedimentation caused by embankments pose a greater risk of coastal flooding than predicted sea level rise. So this image of a climate refugee is actually a typical image of Dolaboko during the monsoon, when water is unable to drain out through an embankment and back into the river. In a delta known for its heavy sedimentation, attributing all floods to rising sea levels due to melting ice caps caused by climate change is problematic. It's a climate reductive translation of floods that stops us from discussing the biggest elephant in the room, how existing infrastructures are choking the veins of life of South Asian canals and rivers by stopping silt from depositing and thus reducing their water retention capacities when monsoon rains are actually becoming heavier and more unpredictable. Longer dry seasons, scarcity of water in sometimes excess in others. So I believe that climate pluriverse might be an important way of operationalizing this intervention and contest the ways in which knowledge production of climate change reproduces colonial development paradigms and the co-option of adaptation projects. In a way, attending to local lived experiences, oral and archival histories of environmental change can help us dislodge some of the entrenched knowledges in this field, contesting particularly the suitability of Dutch holder expertise in monsoon wetland ecologies with heavy sediment loads like the Bengal Delta. Indeed, such an approach might confirm claims by pluriverse theorists about the importance of remaking politics in a way that is deeply felt, as in experiencing how waterways or veins of life are choked by silt and dying due to modernist infrastructural solutions. But again, these are not hegemonic discourses per se, but they operate through climate reductive translations. Climate change is a spice tied to international, often Western funding. Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Camelia. As you are heading down to Stockholm in the train, I think. All right. We'll have one more. And then we'll have a bit of a discussion, about what we have heard.
Hita is not.
Hita is here. Okay, yeah.
Continue.
Okay. All right. And I will finish the recorded ones first. So.
Hi everyone, my name is Hita Krishnan and until recently I was a research associate at the University of Sheffield. Since
Can you hear
June,
that?
I've taken up the role of an assistant professor at the Institute for Global Sustainable Development
Sorry.
at Warwick. Unfortunately, I could not be with you all in person today, and hence I'm recording my intervention. In the rest of my presentation, I will describe some of the work I've undertaken and how certain experiences have led me to pay attention to multiple ways in which we know the world, experience the world, and collect data around the world, both in the context of social and environmental problems. And from there, I will discuss the three most important questions that thus spring to mind when I think of climate pluriversalisms. So, a lot of my work is focused on documenting social and environmental changes in the South Indian city of Bangalore, particularly from the perspective of its ancient man-made lake system, which can transform the city from a barren landscape into one that is characterized by flows of water. Now, as the city grew, the demand for water increased, and this led to the proliferation of pipe long-distance water supply networks that today characterize much of the city. What remains, however, of the original lakes are what you see in these pictures. A road which is named after a lake that used to be there, now conveniently obscured by a tree, and serving as a place for beggars asking alms. Another picture shows the remains of what used to be the sluice gate to the lake, which sort of regulated the water flow to the lake. And a temple formerly on the banks of the lake that is flanked today on both sides by extremely busy roads. So this is the kind of landscape that I work on. What you see in these maps are examples showing the scale of transformations that I have been interested in, both in terms of individual water bodies as well as the entire network, and whose stories of change have taken me through multiple sources, from field ecological studies to historical records, GIS, and oral histories. It is some of these experiences that I would like to share now. During my fieldwork, one of the biggest examples of plural understandings came within the context of what a village was and what a city was. Bangalore today is a bustling metropolis. No one who visits the city will think of it as having strong agrarian or rural roots. Yet, Bangalore as a city has grown by engulfing the villages around and whose inhabitants still associate that village as being a deeply important part of their identity. They do not talk of their loved ones as having been married in Bangalore the city, but rather as having married from one village into another, implying the crucial role that the village still occupies within collective public consciousness of people inhabiting that people. And marriage is one of these circumstances when you see a lot of these pluriversalisms coming into play. And in this particular case, it was what is a village and what is a city, and whose knowledge of the city counts really. And also sort of whether memories are reflections of some of these multiple ways in which we know the landscape. So that was something that came out very strongly in the work that I had done. Another thing that was interesting to me in my own field work was how subjective memories were and how memories sometimes played a role in both reinforcing or hegemonizing the dominant discourse. For example, there's certain collective amnesia towards acts of genocide or conflict, which in a way serve to perpetuate the collective consciousness of harmony and goodwill. Now, where I saw this in practice was an encounter I had in studying what was a Hindu-Muslim conflict in the 1920s. I went from pillar to post trying to figure out what this particular conflict was about, and it turns out it was conflict between two religious groups, the Hindus and the Muslims. And what was interesting was how subjective these memories were. The elders of the community maintained that the conflicts were not something that I should be sullying my delicate ears with, while other people perpetuate the notion that in driving away Muslims from the area and establishing collectivities or collective entities for their particular castes in houses that were formerly occupied by Muslims, justice was served. Now, this really begs the question, what are the different forms of what is true about memories? I mean, there are different versions of this Indo-Muslim conflict that I found, some in the archival records and some in the collective consciousness of people. But also there is something that these memories serve to perpetuate. And what is that something that those memories seem to perpetuate? And that was something that came out quite strongly in the work that I've been doing. Then there was also data that I used for the work. I found myself originally interested in what the official archival records had to say. But then I also quickly realized that other places within the city might also in fact act as archives of knowledge and serve knowledge production. Oral histories passed down by word of mouth, origin stories, and myths that are associated with practices around water bodies are some such examples. It then became a very important project for me to look at how these different forms of knowledge practices converge around or diverge in a particular landscape and what that really means for equity and sustainability. Another important thing that came out of my data quite strongly was how different prosperity, the notion of prosperity has been for different groups of individuals. For example, for some people, it was a material possession of a house and a lot of money, modern amenities, and other modern amenities as well. But for others, it was a fact that they owned livestock and as such felt their life to be more secure than their counterparts. But also the differences in worldviews came to light very starkly, for instance, when communities described who owned livestock described how difficult it was to find a bride as opposed to those who do not. And what that really means for these individuals' own relationship with nature in the form of their livestock and the sustaining their own livelihoods through nature, those became interesting elements of what I became interested in. So this led me to my current interest in climate pluriversality and the idea that we could come together to form this little collective that might engage with it in more meaningful ways. Drawing on my own experiences, there are 3 questions that I would like groups such as this to address, especially when we think of climate pluriversalities. The first is, how do pluriversality shape lived experiences of climate change? When each of us interprets climate change in different ways, when different entities interpret it in different ways, what does that then mean for the lived experiences of the people who live under that particular worldview? And I think that's something to also consider given the direction the world is going in today. The second question I have is, how do we allow us to unpack diverse lived experiences of climate change? Having a notion is not enough. We need to be able to apply it in a certain way and sort of diagnose what we mean when we say pluriversalities. So really, what added value does pluriversality give? Multiple ways of knowing, but who's knowing and who's prioritized in that knowing? The third question is, how can they help us in crafting a more just and sustainable world? I think these are the three important questions, because especially the latter, because if we want to have climate transitions, then we need to be able to consider all of the injustices and exclusions that are currently part of our environmental discourse. And so a pluriversal thinking can actually help eliminate some of that. And I think that's sort of the way that we could organize ourselves into these pockets, so that through the course of the next few months, so that we can actually think about some of these questions and refine them further, and so on and so forth, before actually talking about it to wider audiences and so on and so forth. That being said, thank you so much, and I would love to continue interacting with you over the next few months. Again, apologies that I've not been there in person, but I'd love to get to know all of you very soon. Thank you so much, and have a nice day.
Thank you, Hita.
All right. So, thank you for
Maybe
that.
we invite Emmanuel as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
So this is the last. So we have 4, and then we'll break. Yeah. So Emmanuel, hi. Emmanuel, can you hear me? He just sent his slides. Hi, Emmanuel, can you hear me now?
I can hear you. It's a bit of a public
hi.
space. Good.
Yeah, we can hear you okay. So we can hear you, so don't worry. Do you want to share your slides from your end?
I was trying, but please, can you try share? I see it's not coming.
Just a second. I think because I have to make you a co-host. Yeah. Can you try now? It should work now.
No, it's not coming. Can you just double check your email? I already sent on your side. If you could send from that end.
Okay. I have your slides. Yes. Do you want me to share it? Okay.
Yes, please, because it's not working on this side.
Okay. That's fine.
Hello, everyone. As Tanzil is pulling out my slides, so let me just continue because it's something that I'm working on, so it's very familiar. Everyone, my name is Emmanuel Sule, and let me put on my camera for a few minutes if the network holds. So put the face.
Yes, we can see you.
So my name is Emmanuel Sule, and I'm based at the Aga Khan University in Arusha, Tanzania. I'm the director for the newly established entity called Arusha Climate and Environmental Research Center. It's a center mainly established to be part of the process of making a university much more comprehensive and not only focusing on health sciences. So environment is really central if you are actually talking of human health. So today, I'm sharing an experience of what we are developing as a living laboratory for climate and environment. And given that the Global South has a lot of experience in climate impact, from droughts to flooding, it is time for researchers and scholars and students and communities and practitioners to really look inward and understand what do they have to offer, so that they can actually address these climate issues from their own local perspectives, using their own environment as living lab. So this living lab to us is very central. And next slide, please. So the Aga Khan University established a center way back in March 2022, so that the center actually utilized existing landscape of about 3,300 acres as a living landscape where communities, researchers, practitioners, and communities can come actually and do experiential learning, more importantly on land restoration. And we want to explore that when we are talking of different worlds, the climate pluriverse, there are so many that really need to look into context specificities. And by context specificities, I can pull off my video. I see the internet is becoming unstable. We really want to have a landscape. So the picture you see on the slides is exactly what you can see when you come to our center. We have a community outreach center in a yellow. Don't move, please.
Yeah, sorry.
We have a demonstration plot where farmers can come and learn about smart agriculture, regenerative agricultural techniques, where we plant indigenous crops, indigenous trees, and we have a tree nursery, and we have recovered huge number of wildlife, pollinators, including butterflies, cats, and we are collecting a lot of data. And therefore, our landscape is not only high in ecological terms and for learning and experiential purposes, but we are driving research and innovation in sustainability and environmentalism in what I call a living laboratory, and I will explain more. But our Aga Khan University's Arusha Climate and Environmental Research Center provides opportunities where people who are coming, including students and researchers, to be immersed in this natural environment where they can learn and co-create research ideas, priorities, and co-implement them. So we believe the model of living laboratory is a solution when we try to address climate issues, environmental issues in our different worlds in the global south. By having a living laboratory settings, we integrate research, innovation, and training in a natural environment and context-specific settings where we actually do our research to address the needs and priorities of our communities. So in the northern part of Tanzania, Arusha, we are really focusing on two groups of farmers and pastoralists. Next, please. So the living laboratory settings really allows us to educate future leaders in environment. We want to have students who are good stewards of our environment, providing them with the skills, attitudes, and attributes necessary to bring change and make them leaders in our environment. We want students and researchers to really do applicable research, not a fancy research, not helicopter research, but actually research that provides scholarship, professionals with the skills that are sorely needed to address global climate and environmental challenges, including the key that is environmental restoration. We want to make sure that the research we do is accessible to communities, we say, regardless of their financial, geographical constraints. And in the picture, you can see clearly this is a group of high school students learning in our arboretum the importance of tree species culturally, socially, economically, and environmentally. And it's not a professor that is teaching them, but rather an elder from the indigenous group called the Maasai. And when the student vote of their experience, the best professors or the teachers are always the indigenous leaders because they have a profound experience of the environment and the values that trees bring. Next, please. So at our center, already within the past year and a half, since we established the idea of living lab and providing these experiential learning opportunities to students, we are seeing that these can really provide opportunity for communities to learn and apply, and we make the landscape accessible to communities. So every day, every Friday, our neighboring communities can walk in, study what we're doing in agriculture, in trees, what we're planting, and we also distribute trees. And we believe climate change cannot be addressed by not only addressing these theoretical gaps, but also by integrating the solutions that we can find, and also do more studies on these solutions if actually they're viable or not. So these opportunities provide students with the principles of climate solutions that they can use in variety of ecosystems that include urban, peri-urban, rural, and also in rich landscape like the Tanzanian national parks. So already we're doing a lot of internships and summer school and field school. In the picture you're seeing is another group of Canadian students in a remote, very dry landscape of the Maasai people. And the Maasai elder is also explaining that if you leave the nature untouched with the principles and the skills that the Maasai have, it will regenerate. But these students couldn't believe that this land will have grasses when it rains. And after two months, when it rained, it was lush green. And I sent them photos and they couldn't believe it. So the Maasais have indigenous knowledge. And the idea of climate change is that we actually have to tap into existing indigenous knowledge. And therefore, actually, what we need is to use what the Canadian scholars have developed as they call it a two-eye seeing framework. You combine your indigenous knowledge and your scientific knowledge, you blend it, you find a solution that is suitable to a specific context. So for us, this is working very well, but we need to do more research. What is working, what is not working, by integrating our indigenous knowledge. Next, please. So how do we do? It's really a collaborative effort. At Aga Khan, we are very few who have studied climate and environment. So we work with international universities, local universities, Tanzanian universities. So we have large numbers of universities in Tanzania that have signed MOUs with that. We also work with our entities, Aga Khan Foundation and other institutions. We have big universities joining us. Next, please. So why are we concerned with climate change? I'm not going to go into the much details on this, but what is important is that in Tanzania, we are feeling what we already know, that our planet is facing twin challenges of climate and biodiversity loss in unprecedented rate. And we also know that our planet is close to reaching the limit of 1.5 degrees Celsius, that there will be a lot of catastrophic impact to humanities and also non-humanity or non-human species. But what I want to stress is, even though the threats are real and are coming, but every act to slow down and or to avoid the world to reach this catastrophic temperature limit counts. So in our center, we do all this restorative effort so that we bring back our ecosystem that we have a control of, like degraded landscape through reforestation. Next, please. So how do we do that? It's really by understanding the differentiated impact of climate change. Because we all take climate change as, yes, it really hits everyone, it has no borders. But as even those who presented previously today have really shown that climate change needs to be understood, that it is socially differentiated and must be understood as such. In my context in Tanzania, which is part of the larger global South, pastoralists suffer a lot from climate change because of long droughts. Farmers' productivity have declined and crop nutrients have declined. These are very important, but hunter-gatherers who still exist in Tanzania are now losing access to their critical nutrient food. Those include fruits, honey, and their landscape is also getting encroached. So we really need to unpack these pre-existing and created class dynamics and social differentiation within climate studies and different world that we are studying. And we know that the wealthy can easily diversify while the poor are highly affected. Next, please. So very quickly, in East Africa, this is so important that climate change is predicted to bring a lot of vulnerability because of flooding, droughts, and we have seen it this year. Kenya, Tanzania, all people have been affected in different ways. Uh, just to run through, there's a lot of prediction that a lot of people in these countries will face a lot of depression and post-traumatic stress disorders due to loss of land from flooding and so forth. But I'm just going to move very quickly. Next, please. Um, So this is what I was just doing. It's a very low technology approach where you have a seedling of indigenous trees and local and suitable fruits that you can plant. You cannot change the landscape. This is our tree nursery in Arboretum. Next, please. So as we speak, majority of our land within our landscape is reforested, restored in many ways, and is sustainably farmed. Next, and we are demonstrating these initiatives because we really see these efforts and techniques working, and people can learn. And they're asking themselves, why is Aga Khan land green? We can make our own land also green. And that is a typical solution, but it helps also. I will be winding up. So, reflections. As we are talking about really climate pluriverse, we really need to reflect on every actions that we do in the global south. So this is my quick reflection on the living lab experience. Why do we say it's important to have something that we can start with when we are unpacking these ideas of climate change and being really people-driven initiatives and studies? To me, and many that are working with me in the center, we believe that the living lab concept, if it's locally driven, design based on the priorities of people, it's highly inclusive and decolonial in practice. Because we are not borrowing everything. First of all, everything that is done somewhere doesn't really work. We don't have ice or whatever in Tanzania, but in the north maybe they have ice and glaciers. But we also feel that by really having a landscape where people can learn and meet, and we look into the priorities, the living lab concept helps communities and intellectuals cross-fertilize their ideas and utilize plenty of indigenous knowledge and skills that are critical. But also Living Lab allows continuous learning by both researchers and community of practitioners. And also in many ways, it helps influence policy decision making at all levels because everyone can see something is changing and they can really use to influence, even if we scholars are not at the forefront. Next, please. So as I mentioned, the indigenous knowledge. Some of you probably knows this phrase, and I will repeat. In Africa, when an elder dies, they say the whole library is burned up. That is because not all the knowledge that the elders have is transmitted to younger generation. So in Tanzania, for example, the Maasai, for many years have used their indigenous knowledge, indigenous or traditional governance mechanism to use land and natural resources effectively. So on the left in my camera, you can see that the Maasai are drawing the land use. And on the right, you can see the cows on the foothills of Old Donyo Lengai, which means the mountain of God. This is an active volcano in Ngorongoro district. And Maasai have been living there. They have never put a building next to the mountain because that is a dry land or dry season grazing areas. But because of our ignorance as scholars or maybe policymakers, we ignore all what they have been doing and also replace with what we call modern, which I actually don't appreciate too much because it actually misses a lot of context. And that's why some of the environmental issues and climate issues we are having is because of our ignorance to really incorporate and build on existing indigenous knowledge. So next, please. So for us, this is important, and that's what we are taking so much. So with this, I want to say Asante Sana. Thank you so much. That's a picture of a lovely Mount Meru. picture from our flight. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much. Can we visit soon? I'll get flights. Sonata here. Okay. All right. So maybe, yes, Emmanuel, can you mute yourself? Okay. Okay. Happening.
We don't need to
Okay.
do that.
Whatever comment, I'll relay it back, I think.
I think they can hear.
Okay.
Yeah.
All
I
right.
can hear you.
Okay, so now it's open to the floor. So maybe we'll have like a 15-minute reflection on what has been said so far. And then we'll have a coffee break, 15 minutes, 10 minutes, and then we'll reconvene for the other 4. So who would like to start? Saba? Yes, please go ahead. I mean, what do you... Yeah.
And really enjoyed the presentations. And one of the things that got me thinking in relation to the Pakistani context and what people have talked about in terms of the pluriversality of knowledge and that coming in from the global north and also indigenous knowledge. So I just wondered if you could perhaps speak a bit more, unpack the various forms in which knowledge from the north is produced, because that coincides with the knowledge at the global, with the indigenous communities. How can we tackle those? So for instance, when we talk about a lot of these international NGOs or World Bank projects that are coming, so that's a source of funding that we're talking about. But are we also looking at the technical knowledge that they're bringing, or the hiring of the different consultants? Because in the Pakistani context, that's what we see, that a lot of international consultants are hired, thereby ignoring the local knowledge or people who've been embedded on the ground for many, many years. So if you could maybe unpack that a little bit, beyond funding, what are we thinking in terms of knowledge production coming in from the north, and then maybe think about what are the spaces that we can intervene, or how do we tackle that, or how do we mobilize against those hegemonic kind of ideals. So that's something that I picked up.
Are you asking someone, or you're just throwing it?
I just thought maybe it would did that resonate with other people? How do other people think? Because when we talk about knowledge production, maybe we can disaggregate it and see and then expand that a little more.
Sarah, hi, Camelia, please.
Hi, thank you. I think that's an excellent question. Can you hear me? I'm so sorry for not being able to participate today.
Yes, we can.
Okay. Sorry, what was the name of the person who asked the question?
Saba.
Saba. Thank you, Saba, for that question. I didn't get to speak of the entire work, and it's not really only about the funding, but I also talk about something called development assemblages. And so basically that the climate reductive translation will depend on the type of donor and the project, so who they will tend to hire. So in some projects they might want to hire local consultants, and in others, as in the embankment case, they might engineers, or as the embankments were first built in the 1950s, they also had American consultants as well as these Dutch polder experts. So in terms of knowledge production, in my chapter 2, I look into that, because that funding also comes with some political constraints. So how they might want to hire their own, so to say. And sometimes they are very, as you mentioned, they don't care about local context and just have this uniform model that they think will fit. So I think it's extremely important in terms of the pluriverse to make sure that we, as Emmanuel pointed out, provide this context-specific information. I'll just start there and see what everyone else says.
I mean, I'll just add something. I mean, when you say the local, what do you really mean? I have I have really Western locals in Bangladesh, who are local, but their thinking is more Western than someone from this, I don't know which West, but it's not indigenous. Let's say the other way around. It's not indigenous. So it's like a local, non-local, but like the multiplicities of local, Yeah, Camelia, please.
No, and I think that's really important because I've noticed one thing, and it's this code switching between Bangla and English. So you have Bangladeshi engineers who are Western trained who will, repeat this external model of modernity and science, right? Like from the colonial past, controlling the delta, controlling the river, using concrete. But then when I've spoken to them in Bangla and probed them about Jolobodho and waterlogging and these things, then they will admit it's the embankments. They understand the tides and the sediment and all of that. But then when push comes to shove, they're being funded by a project. They have an employer and there's an official script that they have to stay by. So it's like a golden handcuff.
So it's not a question of not knowing. It's just that it's not convenient to let other people know that you know that. So maybe we'll take
exactly. They can be blacklisted and lose their job opportunities if they speak out too much with their local knowledge.
Yes. Jobs. Always it's the jobs. Emmanuel and then Emmanuel.
Thanks, Camelia and Tanzil. I think my addition is that clearly we are seeing a big difference in terms of the education that is well blended, because most of our people in the global south, we get this Western education, in most cases make us subjects really, not necessarily liberated folks. And this is not my thinking, actually it's the Masai elder who was giving a lecture to Aga Khan University students who are studying master's degree and their teachers. And they actually ran into a real argument, like, is this education helping you? Because if it's helping you, you cannot be avoiding small things that you should have been doing better. So I think the motive that when we are looking about these climate pluriverse is really going beyond decoloniality and doing a lot of self-reflection. So I'm working on a piece, for example, for conservation, and say from decoloniality to liberating conservation, really. So education, and these are also not my own words, I'm paraphrasing from Isa Shivji, who is a leading Tanzanian scholar, saying it's not enough to just talk about decolonizing education. Education must continue to be liberated so that actually people understand why engineers have to really not only look into the soil texture, but go ask the elders on the movements of water, the rivers, and flooding systems. Because most of the roads that we have in global south cannot withstand the impact of climate change, particularly flooding. So I think as scholars meeting today, we have so much to do in terms of reflecting and acting differently. Yeah. Thanks. But one more point. I think what I'm seeing is that the groups of indigenous and local communities are actually beating us in terms of changing the narrative, fighting the World Bank, for example, and even the major conservation groups. Now everyone is talking about indigenous knowledge and indigenous people, putting safeguards there. So I think the scholarship need to push more on that. Yeah, thanks. Let me stop there.
So, yes.
Yeah, so my questions to specific of Camelia.
Yeah.
So I work a little bit on Sundarban during my PhD. So and when I started these things.
So that's the largest mangrove forest.
Yeah.
In the
so
world, yeah.
Lots of just after the cyclone Isla and lots of development happening. Like it's moved. Mostly I did in Indian part of Sundarban. So lots of Athenian embankment project come up from the government, from the Western Development Project also, and then cyclone hits again and again, and the concept of this Athenian embankment has fallen down, and now the nature-based solutions concept is come up in.
It's a new hot thing.
New hot thing in Sundarbans. And
Nature-based.
Lots of people are they are haphazardly try to regenerate mangroves here and there throughout the Sundarban, or maybe throughout.
But just to add to that, this is not just in Sundarban.
Yeah.
This is a whole new push about this idea of nature-based solutions.
Yeah,
that's attracting a lot of
so
funding.
I'm just like my questions, like this kind of like approach from global north to global south. So if I compare to the, as it's a Southern theories discussions, and how like and if we think or if we rethink like the concept by a group of people from Bangladesh, like Farhad Nazar and people, they are develop a concept like Nayakisi to revive the two types cultivations culture which was practiced in colonial time in Sundarban or Delta or lower part of the Bangladesh and India. So in my work I have discussed people that they said that, oh, before the ILA we have practiced 3 times cultivations, but because of the commodifications of land and commodifications of gear cultivations entirely changed, and through these commodifications or through this global, what is this economical
imperatives.
Yeah. So, and how the knowledge from the indigenous people, particularly in Delta Bengal Delta regions, can be revived through the Western academic discourse.
I mean, I'll just paraphrase this because I think the question is very valid, not just in that context, but every time we talk about indigenous knowledge as a substrate that you can just go and then say, oh, let me just take a little bit of it and then put it into this larger, economic and system that is what to do in that. So it's not just about Western academia, but in general. Because if the Western, if for example, if the indigenous knowledge system has no notion of private property, and you still have the private property laws existing, then at what point can this be assimilated, or can there be contradictions, and can there be this messiness, which is not resolvable, by definition? Maybe I don't know if this question is. Sorry, Martin, you have something to add? You add that, and then we'll go back.
Just very briefly, off the back of what you said and of the presentations, one of the things that all this has been making me think about again is really. So it seems to me it is also, but it's not only a question of knowledge and whose knowledge counts and whose. It is also a question of who has access to the definition of a problem. And one of the things that I think I sometimes forget, and then are forced to remember time and time again, is that the very idea of climate change is by necessity a deeply abstract idea. Right? None of us, nobody, nowhere in the pluriverse experiences climate. Right? We just experience variations of weather transformations and other kinds of environmental transformations. They become climate through a series of abstract operations. And so so in a way, the climate pluriverse, as it were, is always already given. But the way in which the climate change operates as precisely a kind of as an operative tool in funding agencies, in development agencies, in this entire sort of development world, slides the abstract nature of it such that it is the abstract, and by abstraction I don't mean obviously I don't mean it's not there. I just mean that it's of a different order to the experienced environmental transformations that this locale or this world is living. And I was just mindful of your mention of this sort of Pokorai, I think it was this.
It's oracle, yeah.
Pokorai,
It's
this,
like afterlife, the notion of
this idea of afterlife, the idea that Amelia raised of climate change as spies, in other words, as a kind of tactical maneuver to negotiate one's way through the world of development funding and so on. It strikes me that in some of these cases, there is precisely a contestation. In other words, worlds are made and unmade through the construction of problems and it is the construction of problems that make certain kinds of knowledges matter and others not. Right? And climate change operates interestingly, ambiguously, I think, ambivalently, both as a kind of something that stirs the pot and forces a kind of activity of problematization, but also as something that profoundly seems to kind of stifle the very different and situated modes of problematization that could take place. Because if you don't claim climate change and therefore submit to the logics by which climate change is normally identified in scientific terms, in Western terms, and so on, then you're not actually constructing a legitimate problem. Right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So thinking about kind of modalities of problematization is also an interesting way potentially of getting out of the problem you just raised, Hansel, which is not just the sort of fixity of the category of indigeneity, and which has always a very problematic historicity as well, because of extremely complex histories of migration and so on, but also the kind of pre-existing, the sense that knowledge, so-called indigenous knowledges, are just there. They are kind of pre-existing solutions to problems we haven't posed yet. Right? So if we approach, this is what I'm thinking aloud, if we approach the question of the climate pluriverse as a practice of problematization, in which a whole variety of divergent practices figure in, and there are all manner of struggles and strifes over how those problems are posed, then perhaps we kind of begin to unmoor some of these ways of fixing our own problems that previous discourses, other discourses of decoloniality, the kind of implied geographies of North and South and so on tend to lock us into.
We'll hear from Camelia and come back to you. Yeah, Camelia, please go ahead.
Thank you, both of you, for these excellent provocations and reflections. Can you hear me properly?
Yes.
Is it better now? I think I'll just start with Mariam, because I would really like to discuss this further. What you're talking about of climate change kind of being an operational tool, it relates quite a lot to, I think, how I write also in my book in chapter 2 on how, drawing on Rottenberg's work on aidland, that climate change is used as a meta code that removes context and universalizes a theme so that actors can participate in the technical game of development. So in that sense, climate change is a spice, acts as a meta code in the technical game of development. And I think it's really mindful to be reflective of this, because when we look at Cyclone Isla, for instance, I think it's interesting to hear that after the cyclone, that hare or brackish tiger prawn cultivation increased, and that is now pitched as climate adaptation in this area. But as I've shown also in my migration research, these embankments were broken during Isla because they were so structurally damaged by existing shrimp cultivators that made so many pipes and gates and various illegal cuts in the embankments that once the cyclone hit, they just completely collapsed. During the dry season, where the rivers were full of saline water, so you had like huge salinity intrusion inundating arable fields, and that made it hard to grow rice. So somehow, when you're using climate change as a spice or climate change as a medical, just to participate in the funding game of development, you need to remove this type of important historical and political context. And I do see that maybe nature-based solutions might have a similar type of problem. I was part of co-authoring a paper on overcoming challenges in the Ganges Delta through nature-based solutions, where we discussed tidal river management, which maybe is not an indigenous thing per se, but in the coastal belt before embankments, since the 1800s, earthen bunds or earthen temporary embankments would be built during the dry season to stop salinity intrusion into the newly deforested mangroves, to protect the rice fields. And then they would be broken each monsoon to allow for beneficial monsoon rains. And this is really integral in allowing, the 1 billion ton of sediment in the delta to deposit on these low-lying fields and to raise them. So that is a form of nature-based solution, but Salim Haq instead talked about locally led adaptation based on the people that are living there now. I think in the Bangladeshi context, to use or throw away indigenous, one needs to be very specific. Are you talking about the Garo and Munda communities in the Sundarbans area? Then that is one thing, and maybe their idea of interventions that are needed might be different from Bengalis, Bengali Hindus or Bengali Muslims in the area, and also class and caste based. I'll just stop.
Yeah,
Thank you.
sorry. Yeah, no, we kind of like running out of time for others. So Monica, if it's the concluding one for this session, and then we'll have a bit of time after. But we'll come back to the idea of the problematization, and who gets to problematize what. Yeah. So concluding comment.
Yeah, it's just like sometimes when I hear some things, I get excited and I want to comment more, but it's not super important. So like I was
over coffee.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So guys, we'll take a 10 minutes break and then we'll reconvene at UK time 3:45. All right. See you on people online, and have your coffee online. Okay. All right. See you.
What is
Hi everyone, we'll just start in a minute.
They are not convinced and they're like, no, you shouldn't have this. What is not done, you can do something else, like doctor.
So we'll start with Mariam. Hi Mariam. Can you hear?
Yes, I can hear you just fine. Can you hear me?
Yes. Just so it's gonna be Mariam, then Kavita, then Suchismita, then Adam. Okay. You're gonna speak, but there are no slides, right?
There are no slides, so
Yeah,
this is going to be fairly.
Thank you so much for not having slides.
My pleasure.
Okay. So just give a minute. People are still grabbing their tea.
Absolutely. Well, I have my tea right here too, so
Brilliant. Okay.
I'm happy
Give a second.
to wait.
Okay. Thank you everyone for reconvening. Online there were 20 people. Now it's 16. That's a loss I can manage. That's a good one.
What about in the room?
In the room, they fled. Yeah. No. People are in the loo and getting back. But nonetheless, I mean, now, so I think we'll start with Mariam and then Kavita, you're up, and then Suchismita and Adam, who will be online.
Okay.
All right, Mariam, you are up.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Tanzir and other organizers of this workshop for providing this wonderful experimental platform to speak about the pluriverse from many different disciplinary angles. I myself am a legal and constitutional scholar. So the framing of my provocation today is going to be necessarily limited in that sense. And I just want to say, I'm going to state some propositions very broadly. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So my propositions are going to be broadly stated, and my conclusions are, in all probability, going to be frustratingly ambivalent, because that is the nature of law. And I've titled my provocation, can we interrogate power through the pluriverse? Stated a bit differently, I would want to say, does the law offer any space at all for pluriversal thinking, at least for resisting power? And I just want to start on a slightly cynical note, which is to say that having worked on legal mobilization and social movements and struggles for the past decade and a half in Pakistan, my short answer to that question is most probably no, right? But the problem is, and this is a big however, the problem is that having done some evidence-based work and field work on this particular question, it seems to me that in post-colonial contexts, particularly like those of Pakistan, it's a very different model from Bangladesh. I'm going to come to that in a minute. The law is a primary and preferred tool of the state for coercion, oppression, tyranny. And the problem is that as soon as small movements, struggles relinquish the legal space, it's not as if they're able to very easily disengage with that coercion. In fact, the coercion becomes even stronger, it becomes even more potent, the backlash is immense. And we've had some very interesting examples of small, social struggles on the ground. You may have heard, for instance, of the Aurat March, which is a feminist movement talking about women's, bodily autonomy and rights to, sexuality. It also involves queer communities and so on and so forth. And we've seen how they very actively pursued the route of eschewing any engagement with the law, and how the backlash to that decision was really so powerful in so many ways that what happened was that little struggle on the ground has had to continuously do firefighting insofar as its relationship with the law and state are concerned. So the problem with eschewing law in any movement that has to do with, any social movement that is presenting perhaps an alternative civilizational narrative or pushing back on forces of patriarchy, militarization, so on and so forth, any kind of counter-hegemonic movement, any kind of autonomy movement. The problem in a post-colonial state like Pakistan, which is very deeply sustained by military power, you simply cannot afford the luxury of relinquishing the legal space. And so that space always has to be part, unfortunately, of any kind of strategizing that any of these movements have to do. So on that note, and on the basis of that premise, I just want to say a quick word about how the Pakistani post-colonial development state differs from, let's say, Bangladesh, which, as others have also pointed to, is sort of promoted as the development miracle of today. And you do know that Pakistan and Bangladesh were one till 71. But after that, Pakistan's trajectory has been very different. And Pakistan has really just been a client state, particularly of the US and its allies. It has basically gone down the path of fighting proxy wars. And so whatever development aid was coming into Pakistan was really, co-opted or sort of siphoned into military equipment, military infrastructure, civil wars, wars along the borders, so on and so forth. And so we have a development model which is now really layered and complex. Of course, we've had the neoliberal sort of growth of NGOs and small civil society organizations, heavily funded by INGOs, we've had that model for maybe a decade and a half, starting in the late 90s, but really starting around 2015, when we started to feel the after effects of the war on terror, so to say, we find ourselves in a situation where Pakistan is even more of a security state than it was perhaps back in the 80s or even in the early 2000s. And in 2015, a whole host of INGOs were driven out of the country. Registration of any kind of non-governmental organization was made so prohibitive that, funds, NGOs on the ground that still exist complain about funds having dried out. So we don't have the sort of NGOization, if you will, that you see in Bangladesh. What do we have instead? We have a deeply corrupt and extractive military state, which is currently pursuing a lot of real estate development. And the military is at the forefront of displacing whole communities of people in sort of agricultural lands, coastal lands, you name it. And one of these, and I provided a small link to a write-up on this. One of these is known as the Ravi Riverfront, Urban Riverfront Project, which has been presented or projected as a project for reclaiming, ecological diversity, for sort of creating or for ameliorating the housing pressures within the huge city of Lahore, which is about 12 million now. And the Ravi River is really right outside this city. And so the idea is to really relieve the housing pressures in Lahore, the environmental pressures in Lahore, by creating this really elite sort of development on the riverfront. So frankly, I don't quite understand the logic of that, but I will quote, other sort of environmentalists who are working on this and really point to the massive sort of ecological and climate disaster that we're looking at from this particular development. And so these are two very different narratives of development. And I take everybody else's point here about, well, what is indigenous knowledge, right? And which of these gets accepted and which doesn't, even if it's just talking about alternative narratives of development, indigenous narratives of development. There's a lot of contestation within that as well. But at the supra level, there's this contestation between, displaced communities being displaced and the really self-serving, corrupt sort of development agenda of the military and its civilian allies. And so that is essentially where Pakistan stands in terms of its political economy. And so the question once again is, and I come back around to the original question, which is to say, well, what do we do about how these movements relate to the law and legal actors and institutions, given that, giving up that space really does not seem to be a real option in this context. I think given the fact that law is always double-edged, and the fact that in a country like Pakistan, there is extreme social and economic disparity, law, interestingly and paradoxically, still remains the only institutional channel for allowing space to small movements, actors, struggles that really cannot resist power on the ground, because really, military power has also really made the political process deeply dysfunctional. There's a whole sort of, story behind that, constant political engineering, constantly rigged elections. So now the level of popular trust in the election process is also negligible. So how do you go about dealing with the law in a situation like this? It's a love-hate kind of a situation, You can't live with or without sort of a situation. That essentially is the premise from which I am approaching this. So not at all saying, we need to have hope in the potential of law, but rather saying engaging with the law is a dire sort of necessity within this whole other sort of possibilities for achieving social change. You've got to remain connected with the legal space. And having said that, I'm just going to wrap up very quickly. I'm aware of the time. What should we do when we are engaging with the law? And I'm talking from, once again, the vantage point of being a legal scholar and working with lawyers and legal actors and judges. The first thing is we really need to focus a lot more on forms of socio-legal organization and mobilization that create heterogeneous alliances and collectives around the question of climate change. So we need environmentalists to come together with lawyers, scholars, researchers, and even judges. I mean, I'm happy to report that just a few days ago, there's been a very crucial engagement between cause lawyers who are working on the environment and a group of Supreme Court judges who are very serious about supporting climate change governance. And this exchange really was trying to seek from the legal community the kinds of tools and methods that could be used through the law in order to think about climate change. And of course, the terminology right now, it's not going to change overnight. I mean, the terminology right now is governance, right? And that's, once again, a very neoliberal framework. And neither am I suggesting that, the legal community is necessarily also up to speed in terms of, how to really engage with this, other than from the frameworks of governance. But nonetheless, this has to start, and has to start somewhere, and has to start with coalitions and alliances that are willing to give that space to environmentalists and people working within that area, and those, of course, whose lived experiences of oppression and displacement also are a really critical part of that entire process. The second thing I would say is, building on the first, is really to start sensitizing legal actors. So I don't think that the lawyers necessarily only need to engage with judges or only need to engage through litigation. They really need to be looking at other lawyers and this really huge legal fraternity within Pakistan, and really speaking to younger lawyers directly, because they're deeply atomistic, they're deeply fragmented, they're completely divided along partisan lines. But I think we can agree that climate change is one of those things that really should be something that should be really precipitating some level of consensus within these institutions. So that's another one, and finding the right sort of champions within these institutions to really talk about this. And the third thing, which is really important, is jurisprudential evolution. I mean, in Pakistan, the jurisprudence right now is still revolving around civil and political rights, and to some extent, they talk about the right to life, but not really sort of very more specific, more developed socioeconomic rights. Now there are so many models out there of those rights. We learn so much from South Africa. We debate these within our intellectual circles, but it's really hard to kind of get them implemented within the courtroom. And that's one thing that cause lawyers really need to, be more equipped with, create the space, open this up for at least creating an alternative narrative that moves away from this very sort of procedural and administrative language to more pluriversal narratives, whatever they are. Because even when you see some very progressive judgments coming out on some of these cases of land displacement, you will find very legalistic language. They're talking about procedure, they're talking about how certain board members on that particular development authority were not present, or the voting mechanism was not fully sort of complied with, so on and so forth. And that really, I mean, it's obvious that there is a lot of room for really going into a much deeper level of rights discourse than is currently being engaged with. So I'm going to stop there, but I would, of course, be very happy to answer questions. I just want to say, of course, I'm not posing any kind of solution to the climate issue in Pakistan, but just saying we've got to find a way, in our context at least, to get away from like everyday continuous sort of firefighting with the law and getting more organized and less reactive. And I think the pluriverse really allows space to think about creating an actual narrative, which is not a reactive narrative, which is a narrative which is completely alternative. It's ground up, even though it has multiplicities within it. And to be able to bring those narratives through a formal institutional space, which is the only way right now in Pakistan to really mainstream some of these movements. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. As we set up Kavita, I just have the, I mean, we talk about the right to the city. I mean, what about the right to worlds? You know, do you have the right to make your own world? So next is Kavita. Presentation is this one.
Presenter.
Yes, you can. So we'll share it and then we'll come back to this. Because they can't.
Hopefully see my notes.
Yeah, you'd be able to. So they get to see that.
Perfect.
All right. And
I think it was this one.
yeah. Yeah, all right.
Okay. Thank you so much again to Tanzil, Azra, for just being such amazing hosts and inviting us to Sheffield. And it's been lovely having initial conversations with you, and I look forward to that. So the vantage point that I'm approaching the pluriverse is through a new project I'm starting on extreme heat in India. This is a new project. I just want to emphasize that. So please bear with me. A lot of this is my initial thinking, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your reflections. So one of the questions that Tanzil and the collective posed, I've heard kind of echoes of this from people like Hita, is how do we think beyond binary formations? And for me, one of them is to kind of think beyond discursive constructions of the weather that can also be binary, that can operate through these ideas of thresholds and records. And breaking extreme records. And so for me, the starting point is that the bodily impact of heat can't be encapsulated within these binaries, that we really need to think beyond. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't remark on the extreme heat that people in Delhi and northern India are experiencing at the moment, temperatures that feel like 50 degrees and at nighttime is still hitting 40 degrees Celsius, to give you a sense of what this looks like. Okay, so my kind of lens into this is through conversations around urban planning, geography, urban study. And a piece that was really helpful for kind of synthesizing some of this literature was written by Vasudevan and Navoa. And they asked this question about what are the methodological choices, theoretical contributions, and community-based relationships and commitments of pluriversal planning scholarship. So as Tanzil mentioned, this right to the city, but of course the right to worlds within this city.
Just trying to stop extreme heat.
So some of the ways in which I'm trying to kind of methodologically approach this question, if we are trying to disrupt paradigms and binaries, is by thinking about the colonial climate legacies and measuring weather that really has been inherited and continues. And I'll talk about this in brief. Some of the technocratic fixes, such as heat action plans that are currently being rolled out, that in some ways are acknowledging the kind of vast problem of heat, but are doing so in limited ways, as you can imagine, where people who are coming from caste oppressed and marginalized religious communities and other backgrounds are, of course, bearing the brunt of heat. So how then might we think about a weather from below that really points to kind of emancipatory futures for urban residents? And I think this, for me, is what the pluriverse does. It keeps this kind of hopeful element alive. At least I think so. Okay, so as I mentioned, really thinking about embodied experiences of extreme heat, there's a lot of data about the heat wave days that are being reached, these records, as I mentioned. And some of these words have become almost meaningless or empty. So what does it mean when we talk about something that's extreme, that's breaking records, that is crossing a threshold? What happens to the languages we use, whether it's Hindi in Delhi, or I'm thinking also about Hyderabad, so perhaps Telugu. So what do these languages and discursive constructions of the weather from above, below, in the middle mean? And how does this actively shape urban space? So I think Martin kind of touched upon this, if I understood it correctly, but there's the kind of problematic of the question as well. So this kind of statement of there is heat and it must be acted upon, but the wider questions of how and by whom, and really what are we understanding as heat and this differential social experience? Okay, so kind of briefly to go through these kind of three methods, or these three ways that I'm thinking about it. We have the establishment of the Indian Meteorological Department in 1875. Of course, this is through the British colonial government. There is this, and historians and STS scholars have done a brilliant job of excavating some of these histories, but there is this emphasis on empirics and, of course, scientific measurement, and we know all of these kind of normative understandings that really pervaded the British colonial project. But interestingly, they very much use their bodies as instruments to sense climate. And a lot of that understanding was that only white bodies were sensitive enough to understand heat, that there were different levels of exposure that, of course, brown and white bodies could endure. And of course, that's why there was a lot of kind of experimentation with how much a brown laboring body could actually endure. And a lot of this was to control the tropics, for labor, for extractive racial capitalism, all of this. So there was quite an obsession with measurement. Even though it was under this guise of objectivity, there was this huge embodied component to it. So there are scholars like Bharat Venkat who asks this kind of question of how do we understand this embodied empiricism if we look at these histories. So from there, I'm trying to kind of push at how do we recenter this body for everyday knowledges of weather, but with an explicit social justice, anti-colonial, and anti-racist focus. So if you kind of continue with some STS scholars who've been thinking about pollution and colonialism, Laboran, for example, talks about this old theory of pollution, or the idea that certain bodies can accept certain levels of contaminants before harm occurs, and they term this as colonialism. So what might this mean for heat? And these are some of the questions that I'm trying to reckon with. So how do we understand these official heat action plans, and how do they capture this, right? If we are understanding heat and weather at such a micro scale, what might that mean? And how are these daily limits and irreparable harm measured? And I should point out here that the medical science is still kind of evolving around what the long-term exposure to heat is. There's still a lot of data that needs to be kind of gathered and understood about this, particularly on those who are working outside, of course. So as I mentioned, there's of course these kind of deep inequalities of heat. You have the statistics here, and there's kind of a burgeoning literature around critical heat studies, if I were to term it as such, with some fantastic scholars like Nausheen Anwar, who some of you might know, Nicole Starosielski, and Amita Baviskar, who are talking about how these experiences of heat have been redistributed, and thinking about heat as a weapon, as a form of violence. So I guess the kind of question here then is how do we pay attention to this violence, this really kind of embodied visceral experience, but also remain hopeful for whatever emancipatory futures might emerge. And perhaps that's the tension that I'm still struggling with a little bit here of keeping this critique alive, but also imagining other worlds. Sorry. Okay. So during my PhD research, I looked at eviction and resettlement in Delhi, and this was state-led eviction. And many people who were migrants, who were urban poor, mainly from Muslim and caste-oppressed backgrounds, were moved to the periphery of the city. And it's really interesting. So this is research that I did a decade ago. And if you overlay this on a map that looks at thermal hotspots, you can see that the hottest areas are those on the periphery of the city in the western area where these resettlement colonies are located. So it really gives you this kind of stark image, or a stark sense of how where the urban poor have primarily been kind of shunted off into. A lot of them are working in polluting industries, waste management, all of these other kind of dangerous, toxic industries, are then having to kind of deal with a quite serious scalar difference in heat, as you can see from this map. Okay, so a couple more points for me and I will wrap up. So I really quickly wanted to talk about the heat action plans that are being rolled out. These are mainly state-led initiatives, and recent studies have showed, of course, that there's a lack of kind of teeth to these plans, right? So there's not much kind of conversations around legal accountability. So yes, they might advise that between the hours of 11 to 5, you should not send workers outdoors, and employers should kind of ensure that they have access to water and shade. But where are the kind of legal mechanisms to ensure this? Similarly with infrastructure, we talk about heat needing to be mitigated by access to water, but what happens when you're experiencing drought or water wasn't available to the poorest individuals to begin with? And how do we understand the urban poor who really circulate between varied spaces? They're not necessarily in one location, or they're not necessarily at home. They're working in very mobile and different ways. How do we capture that? Okay, so to conclude then, I guess this question then that emerges for me is where to with the pluriverse, right? So we're talking about the right to the city, the right to be cool here is fundamentally, important for this work. And when it becomes so mapped onto these individual neighborhoods, these individual bodies and homes, how do we ensure that this is something that is understood and planned for in meaningful ways? As I mentioned, this kind of access to shade and water, the infrastructural question is massive. Can't understand heat without it. But also, how might we recenter the body then, which I think for me is so important, not as this kind of colonized, racialized object that we saw with these histories of kind of British weather and meteorology, to understand acclimatization, but really socially differentiated in its impacts and attuned to these questions of thermal justice. So I think I'll end there, but maybe just to add this point, to kind of expand it beyond heat, is how then might we use the pluriverse to redefine urban space? And here the piece, Denzel, that you circulated by, I think it was Moreno Tabarez et al. And City was really useful for thinking about pluriversal urbanisms. Great, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we have the last two. Suchasmita, hi.
Yeah, I have a slide.
Yeah.
So,
Are you able to share?
give me 1 second, please. Unfortunately, no.
Do you want Adam to start and then we can get back to you?
Yes, that's fine with me. But can you see this screen? Like, can you see it now? From
We can see, yeah.
Yeah. Perfect. So I'm Suchasmita. I'm a PhD student in the University of Sheffield, working, and my research is involved in understanding what are the new risks in the disaster-induced resettlement sites. So for me, the first step to understanding the pluriverse is to acknowledge that there are many worlds and many ways of doing things. And taking from Escobar, to diminish the hegemony of experts in creating the ways the world looks, the monolith experience that we are having in it. So we already know that such hegemonic experts from the top down, knowledge that they disseminate are usually unsustainable. And climate change has been a great trigger in opening better pathways in the discussion for degrowth and pluriverse. So for me, the pluriverse for me deeply resonates as a tool for hope and for resistance as well. The communities in the peripheries are the communities where I am actually doing my field work and researching upon are always experimenting and hedging to make their way by extending their lives, like we find in the work of Simon. Here, I would like to bring how communities who face disaster induced displacement found an alternative voice or solution by themselves with disaster recovery, which was initially misplaced by the government and planners. So the narrative is located in Chennai, the southern part of India, and here, like if you know that there was affected by the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004, which hit India as well as many of the other South Asian cities. A very technocratic solution, what happened was immediately after the disaster was that the more importance was given towards relief than recovery. And one of the solution was resettlement. The resettlement was mainly driven by the money that came from World Bank. And the resettlement sites was built like 20 to 25 kilometers away from the actual dwelling or the location of the livelihood of the people who were being resettled. The World Bank, as a funder of these reform measures, opposed in situ resettlement and proposed for relocation to large far off areas where the rationale of providing housing to more people, where the rationale of doing such a um, uh, action was to provide more people housing at a cost effective measure. So just going back a little bit, the history of Tamil Nadu has been such, like at that time, um, when the World Bank started coming and more and more opening of the market was happening in the 90s. Just in that state or sometime before, there was this DMK government who was very pro-poor and they're very inclusive of caste and religious minorities. And during that time, they were trying to make in situ slum resettlement because their vote bank was also uh, the people who were in the margins of the society. But the coming of the World Bank really changed that model of urban, their model of city making. And it was very interesting that when the resettlement sites were made, like the places where it was chosen to make, so it was the main criteria was to move the people away from the risk. But the places where they were being relocated were very, very risky places and was the flood prone area, though, and they continues to have yearly flood. So the community remained in the risky places even after resettlement, while the same high risk area were made by the side of the sea was made very livable places for the affluent communities, as well as with due time we saw a lot of commercial and up end markets coming up at that at those very spaces from where the people were being removed. So yet this houses, so the resettlement side, just to give you idea of it, was these huge, completely homogenized looking building at a huge scale in the peripheries of the city, and like making it difficult to continue for the communities to live with their families with the way of life that were familiar to them, the livelihood and even the education for their children. The size of the house was extremely small, The inefficient space design without any consideration of past living condition, cultural dimension, employability, or spatial requirement resulted in abandonment of the government low-income housing, and the people who were most vulnerable stayed behind as they had literally nowhere left to go. So now the people who left behind, or those who were moved initially in the resettlement site, um, were people who have always built their homes with their own hands. um, the houses they lived in prior to tsunami was built by them in the waiting period. So the resettlement site also took some time to build, and each of these resettlement the waiting period for the people was like 5 to 15 years. So during the waiting period, there was not much solution that was given, but some sheds was made for them of tarpaulin sheet, which was extremely inefficient relief measures. So the people during that long waiting period also kept on making their houses with their own hands. So now in the resettlement site, when their homes were not livable anymore, they began to build extensions which looks somewhat like this. Like this is one of the example of extension. um, so because they were in the habit of building homes and spaces with their own hands, they also in the resettlement site built this extension beyond the approved sanctioned houses given to them by the government or urban planners. So building extensions were a multifaceted response to their unlivability and a means to find new ways of making household economies work. So in the picture, the extension that you are seeing is it started as a flood mitigation plan, like the raised structure that can be seen here was actually encouraged by the government and the disaster management people to for them to build after that being covered by the media extensively, that how these resettlement sites are getting flooded annually. So they actually encourage them to make this flood mitigation plan by, they themselves with their own hands raise these kind of buildings. And so slowly once this flood mitigation plan was they did this flood mitigation structure, they also made a shed, and where they used to do some bit of gardening. In the side there is a space of storage, and it act because their living space itself is like a one room living spaces was given to them. And um, and the garden also act as a green cover for them. Before this, the people were never consulted or participated in the decision making of in the matter of construction material or the green cover. These developments were very spontaneous and gradual, and each of this came over like a large period of time have passed, from the flood mitigation structure to the greenery to the storage space that happened eventually. Um, these extensions have many multiple functions. Some of them use it as a livelihood by putting a stall for selling food items or setting up a tailoring shop. It is also a good measure for flood and heat mitigation as a place for gathering, which was very common way of being in their previous location. Um, Now, these extensions are outside the government plan, as I explained before, and should not have been here as per the law, and yet it continues to be there as a force of common solidarity, resistance, and maintaining tactful silence about it. Here I find Martin's call for no jubilant solution, but to go for careful and pragmatic experimentation, a very good response to these kind of plural solutions that come up from the margins. Because when I was talking with my respondents as well as my interlocutors, they were they prefer to be silent about these new ways of living arrangement that they made, which at times might be outside the law, or many a times even be called illegal, though I'm not very comfortable with that word. But it's just that we ourselves now have to come with new words to explain these kind of phenomena. So Apart from extension, there are a number of plural ways that people in the peripheries continue to exist, and the people have been constantly finding these plural solutions by not making much noise about it, or specifically looking for legitimization from outside. So, so my question here to the larger audience is that how do we respond to such plural practices which thrives in silence and without provocation of any legitimization? Thank you.
Okay, hello everyone, and I will share my screen. For some reason, I cannot share it. I'll try again. It's a PDF file. Can you see my screen now? Okay. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm Adam Abdullah from Pakistan, and I teach courses on urban studies, planning theory, urban mental health at the Institute of Business Administration in Karachi, in Pakistan. And I'm also part of the Karachi Urban Lab, which is a research group focusing on critical research and field methods. And my research is very much linked to understanding conditions on the ground and eliciting. Okay, yeah, let me just turn off the fan. I've experienced some heat. Okay. So our research is basically about getting, eliciting data from the ground on linguistic inputs, sensorial experiences, and subjective interpretations of issues such as urban life, climate, and other related topics in order to address questions around urban living and the formation of human subjects through various kinds of power and knowledges and context-specific manifestations of climate and climate change. And as part of my learning from the field, I specifically look at how the multifaceted domain of climate studies, climate justice, and climate-oriented fieldwork has the potential for engaging with non-academic, non-structured, non-hierarchical ways of talking about and dealing with climate within the everyday lives of urban residents. So the topic of my brief talk today is Thy Will Be Done, To Him We Return, Climate Through the Lens of Faith, which, if some of you can recognize, contains references to two Abrahamic scriptures, the New Testament, the Lord's Prayer, Thy Kingdom Come, Thy Will Be Done, and the Holy Quran, To Him We Belong and To Him We Return. And the objective of this talk is to present a few provocative insights and, more importantly, to present a few potential ways to ask new kinds of questions regarding how we think about and talk about climate. So with these pointers in mind, I will give a background to the methods and the timelines which my data has relies upon. So this map indicates the sites where we have currently worked across, and the research is designed mostly around quantitative surveys as well as qualitative fieldwork across primary and secondary urban sites, focusing specifically on low-income, high-density settlements. In the summer of 2022, we gathered responses from about 13,000 participants located in various informal settlements in Karachi only. And this was about their perceptions of heat and about their exposure to heat and their adaptive strategies. And it was funded by a GCRF grant for a project titled Cool Infrastructures. You can find more details on our website. In May and June 2023, we replicated this exercise for two smaller cities, Hyderabad and Jacobabad. Jacobabad, for some of you who might know, is one of the hottest inhabited places on Earth, with temperatures, summer temperatures often reaching the high 40s and 50 and 51 as well. So this was funded by supplementary grant from IBA to supplement the broader work of the Cool Infrastructures project. We also repeated the same in late summer for 16 other cities in Pakistan, including both large and small urban centers. This was because we tried to capture a variety of lived experiences, living arrangements, and cooling practices of these populations. And we observed how respondents talk about different kinds of understandings or different kinds of realizations, and sometimes retrospective rationalizations, or coming to terms with, or even being grateful for their experiences or events regarding climate, and specifically regarding urban heat. So I will cite a few examples from the field. One of the questions that we asked was, for example, in your opinion, which of the following pose the biggest climate disasters to Pakistan? And then which of the following pose the biggest environmental disasters to your own city, Karachi or Lahore, Faisalabad, wherever they were living? And the options were, intense rains, earthquakes, floods, droughts, etc. And on the first day of the field, we were doing this through online Google Forms data collection. We got calls from the enumerators, from the field staff, that people were responding with statements such as, none of these are a disaster. These are all tests from God. So please, so they were requesting us, please include this as an option on our online Google form. And as the research team sitting back in Karachi, remotely monitoring the field, this was quite enlightening, because not only had we overlooked the option to include none of the above, but also the framing of the question as, focused more on disaster. And we realized this was itself quite flawed. So that was one on the spot, on the field realization. And later we modified the question according to this new input that we were receiving. And here I will cite some open-ended quotes, some perceptions that we received. So one of the Christian settlements that was also affected by heat, but was also being displaced due to a stream upgradation project, was referred to how, it is the Lord's will that is being replicated on earth, and this is, we cannot object to it. And then we encountered people saying this worldly life is meant to be hardship, and that, these are including climate events or extreme events. The hotter it is, the more we will be rewarded, specifically for doing good things under this hot weather, and persevering bodily against climate and environmental extremes, such as going on foot to the mosque to pray. If it's hotter, we will get more rewards for it. And then a reflection on how hell or the afterlife would be hotter, and then this heat is kind of a reminder serves as a reminder to keep on the right track. And if we cannot tolerate this heat, how will we be able to tolerate the rewards for our sins in the afterlife? So all these kinds of discourses. So how does the weather or the climate make us more grateful? And eventually, something that Tanzil pointed out in his talk about, a kind of, I wouldn't say nihilism, or not a kind of fatalism, but a kind of realization that the material artifacts or events in this life are somehow related in reciprocity to the afterlife, or something that is yet to come. And then this changes the perspective of the severity of the climate impact in some ways. That's what we realized. So in a way, it's a snapshot of the kinds of discourses we as field researchers often encounter when we talk to certain communities affected by various types of climate events, including heat and urban flooding. But that said, I must put a few disclaimers here, or the limitations of this data, if you will. Most of my own climate research has been firstly on heat and thermal extremes. The sample has been largely informal, low-income settlements and populations. And thirdly, most of this research has been conducted within the urban and morphological context of Karachi and Pakistan only. So in conclusion, I wonder how such kinds of imaginings of climate can be used to understand the pluriverse nature of climate impact and the corresponding strategies for resilience against these. So it makes you think, is religion an opiate for the masses, or is it little explored domain of talking about and bringing out popular, grounded, embedded discourses and imaginations of pluriversal climate worlds. For example, how can gratitude as an intrinsic force or motivation be considered in terms of academic research as well as relief action in conversations about climate justice and reparations? Or how can convictions around the worldly life and the afterlife be integrated into talking about things like loss, life, property, relief, healing processes, both at the level of the individual and the community? And how can the impermanence and fragility of life, as believed by the sample, be used to structure or guide conversations around compensation, resettlement, migration, as well as the knowledges around homemaking practices? So that said, I don't claim to possess the answers to these questions or provocations, nor can I say for certain that data from these particular samples and sites can provide an overarching framework for theorizing climate from a belief system point of view. But what I can suggest is perhaps a provisional evidence-based way, evidence-backed way of talking a discursive arena, if you will, which might be tentatively brought about that takes into account these kinds of imaginings of pluriversal climate world. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to comments. Any insights that you have from any other context, particularly the understandings of pain, suffering, guilt, gratitude regarding climate and climate change from other religious or spiritual domains will be very helpful and valuable at this stage for me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Adam, for that. I hope I'm audible now. But yeah, I mean, it's open to the floor. I mean, we will transition into Martin's keynote at 5. So I'm aware of the time, and we all need, maybe 10 minutes breathing space. But maybe very quickly, from people who we haven't heard, if you want some comments to sort of wrap up, Angie, please.
Yeah, so I just had a question on kind of the normativity of health and being healthy and being well. Because, when we talk about the importance of healthy life for people,
I'll get out. Yeah, should be okay.
So and then kind of experiencing or kind of embracing extreme heat as almost like a labor for afterlife. So that kind of understandings are there, but then at the same time, extreme heat is a reality for people, and they want to avoid that, and that's also valid as well.
Yes.
So because it really poses existential threat to certain people. And so, thinking about problematization, it's not necessarily that the people who embrace Western modernity necessarily impose health. There are also people, other political subjects who would prioritize health in many different ways. So I'm just curious how we could think about health and its normativity, and how the degrees of that normativity differs depending on the world that we belong. And I'm really curious what Martin thinks about this as a keynote speaker, but it can be generally like for everyone. Yeah.
The ball is in your court, Martin. I mean, not specifically, but in general, yeah. What are the things that you picked up?
It connects very much with what you were presenting as well, right? I mean, especially recentering the body is a very, very important intervention, really, because part of what I have learned from Southern Theorizing is this opportunity to reconnect with the body and embodied knowledges as well. So definitely, I think it is an arena to explore more, and it is one of our maybe fronts to keep in a stronger way as well, for sure. I'm really interested to see how you are going to develop the project further.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Into the unknown.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mariam.
Yeah. So, like, yeah, I believe that Bangladesh have certain kind of the NGO development, and recently I was filling a due diligence form for my project, and they have give a clean sheet for Bangladesh. Oh, you know, no need to do this because they have no less corruption than India to others. Oh,
Really?
yeah.
What?
So
which corrupted person said this?
Yeah, that I was.
It's like cannot be true.
Yeah, so you don't need to do this for Bangladesh. So yeah, my question is to like, as there's a book by Aisha Siddiqui from Cambridge, Wake Up Disaster. So Pakistan's don't have this connection, this much connections for NGO transfer, big NGOs, big fees, UNDP, WWA, etc. Yeah, even WWA don't have their office in Pakistan. So my question is like, but there is a charity system, Islamic charity systems is hugely work to transfer the charity-based money through Hawala and through other different kind of export systems. And during this recent flood, Pakistan flood, and it was heavy. It was heavy. Even your ex-prime minister have a good speech, Imran Khan, to appeal of charity. So, like, how an alternative of Southern theory of this charity system of disaster mitigations, disasters knowledge, but like they are doing these things not only in the post-colonial era from long time, not only in Pakistan but also in other Islamic states. So how this can be a alternative rethinking of knowledge transfer. So it's my questions to her.
I have a great story about how faith is used to raise a lot of money for these disaster events, and then siphoned off. But I'll keep it for next time. I'm gonna grab Martin and head downstairs because we're really short of time, and Martin has something on lecture. And thank you so much. I'll see you downstairs as you sort of informally wrap this. And Esra, you can also ask the online participants.
Yes.
It will take these minutes.
At least 5 minutes. So we have to wrap up as well. Okay, I think you three go and we will follow. Just I'm trying to go into. Yes, we'll see you downstairs. Yeah. Mariam, are you online and do you think you can respond to the question?
Absolutely. And I'll have to make it very brief because I'm mindful of the time, but I just want to say, this may be a very unpopular opinion, especially given that, what just Tanzil said as he was walking out, the fact that faith-based donor-driven agendas are now on the rise, and they've been on the rise for a whole host of things. For Pakistan, I categorically reject this as a method for any form of social change or transformation or climate change mobilization, simply because the use of religion in Pakistan has never, ever ended in a happy story. Religion in Pakistan is exploited, once again, very deeply by the military. There are all these various coalitions of interest. I see absolutely no good coming out of this route. And I know that in the West and in diasporic communities, it's a very popular position to take to talk about faith-based change, to talk about religion and Islam as an indigenous, mass of knowledge. And I'm not an anti-religious sort of bigot, but I do want to say that the fact that the state so deeply co-opts religion for its coercive ends, it just, to me, as a strategic or even normative or ideological take, it is deeply problematic. And I'm going to stop there. I mean, of course, I could have a very long conversation about this, but I'm extremely skeptical. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for the beautiful conversation. Yeah, we just hope to have more time for discussion, but maybe we'll continue downstairs. Yeah? All right, great. Thank you.
Can you tell us which room we're in?
It's the basement floor. As in, it's lecture. Is it lecture room 5? Yeah.
We might. Which floor is it again?
It's the lower ground. So if you enter the it's the lower ground floor. Lecture room 5.
Just wanted to say thank you, everyone, and goodbye from here.
Thank you very
Take care.
much.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Lower means